Okay, hello and welcome everybody. This game I'm going to analyze round 7 from the Cherry Blossom Classic, which was my game against Grandmaster Jesse Kraai. So he is a relatively older GM, but still obviously a strong player, and he does outrate me by about 60 or 70 points or so. So we're like maybe fairly close in rating, but yeah, he's definitely very experienced. So my opening choice here, I'm trying to remember because at this point I played the game a few weeks ago. I have a bit of a backlog of games to analyze. But I did know that he played the French, so I was playing white this game. And earlier in the tournament I had won a really nice game with this system against another Grandmaster. But for this game I decided to play something different. I played d4. And it was mainly because I saw he plays a line of the Nimzo that I actually play myself sometimes. So we got this position over the board. In general, I think it's not a bad idea to just mix up your openings in open tournaments because that makes you very unpredictable. So like if my opponents are going to be preparing for me in the future and they see that like I've played e4 and I've played d4 and I've played knight f3, I've played all three of these moves in this tournament, then they're going to think, well, I'm not so sure what to expect. Whereas if I play e4 every game, or if I play knight f3 every game, or if I play d4 every game, then I'll be much more predictable that way. So I think with white, it's definitely a good idea to have a bit of a mixed bag of openings, so you're more of a moving target. On the other hand, then if you play a lot of different openings with white, you often aren't able to specialize as deeply in one opening system. Like if you play d4 and that's your main opening repertoire, then like you're probably going to know that move very, very well and all the different lines that you can get from there. So anyway, this game we got this Nimzo Indian, and I played e3. So he plays the same way that I like to play. He castles, and he plays essentially the Karpov system, which is this line where black plays c5 and d5. And it's considered just to be a very solid way for black to play. And for example, the main line here after knight f3, black would play d5. And I was prepared to go into an interesting line here with taking on d5 and taking on c5. This is not really the main way to play. And I think Hare Krishna has played this with some regularity, but typically, like after knight bd7, well, black wants to recapture this with a knight. The idea is after castles, knight takes c5, white plays this really nice maneuver, knight e2, and basically says, I'm okay to part with my light square bishop, and in return, I'm going to have pretty much full control over d4. So we'll play b3, bishop b2, and our knights are very harmoniously placed here, f3 and e2. And I actually have analyzed this a little bit from black's point of view, and somewhat surprisingly, I couldn't find like clear, easy equality for black. I think this is definitely still playable for black. It doesn't like refute the Nimzo Indian, but yeah, I was a little surprised that this position was kind of tricky for black to handle. It just seems like you have the bishop pair, so things shouldn't be that bad. But no, there is some strategic danger here for black. Like if we, for example, ever trade off the dark squared bishops, then it's very easy to be stuck with a good knight versus bad bishop situation. And even if we don't get to trade off these bishops, these knights can be very annoying if they end up on like d4 and f5. When they're in contact with the king side like this, there can be all these sacrifices on g7. There's a lot of pressure on this diagonal usually. So it's like not super easy for black to play. So anyway, I would have been happy to go into this kind of position, but he surprised me a little bit here. He played d5 first, which, okay, it could still transpose. I played knight f3, he could play c5. But he actually deviated a little bit from what I knew to be his normal repertoire. He played b6. And yeah, I don't think in the database, I don't think I was able to find any games where he played this way. So, okay, here I was pretty much out of my like prep for the round. It wasn't a huge deal because I still have a fair amount of experience in the structure. So white wants to take on d5 here. Basically now fix black's pawn structure now that black has committed to this move b6. So ideally in this kind of situation, black would prefer to have this b7, c6, d5 setup. But with the pawn already on b6, okay, black is a little bit less flexible. He's kind of more committed to playing for c5. Otherwise this pawn on c7 can just become a weakness. It's on the open file, and if your pawn was still on b7, you could play c6 and have this pawn be nicely defended by the other one on b7. Okay, So yeah, here there's kind of, well, there are two ways to play this position with white. I knew the most common way, which is basically just play for this a3, b4, and b5. So once we can get a pawn to b5, then we're going to just try and fix that guy on c7. And if you ever play c5, then we'll be able to take en passant and leave this pawn isolated. That's pretty much the main idea. There's actually another way to play this position. So the other way is you can go for this Pillsbury attack style with knight e5 and f4, which I actually did consider here. So you could start this off by, for example, castling. Then after bishop b7, you could play knight e5. And this actually is a little bit dangerous. Like, I didn't fully believe in this because I thought that after something like c5 and then knight c6, black would very quickly get some counterplay against the center. And I generally don't feel super comfortable like giving myself permanent weaknesses, like the squaring e4. But yeah, I mean, I think white can play this way. Like, you can play knight e2 here, just make sure this is solid. And black is going to go for this queenside counterplay, so he's probably going to play for something like b5, or yeah, c4, get this bishop back, then play b5, b4. And I mean, this is an interesting position. Like, we can get bishop c2, for example, let's say b5. I mean, this is just one sample line to show what one of white's ideas could be, is eventually, we can get some position like this, and now white will play a move like knight h5. And this is how we kind of start this attack. Yeah, I mean, this is maybe not so easy for black to play. Like, it should probably be around equal, but white always has these kind of attacking chances, and black's counterplay on the queen side is never super scary. If you ever play c4, you're also going to give up on any dreams of counterplay in the center, because you won't be able to take on d4 anymore. So yeah, maybe in the future this would be a way to consider playing instead. But okay, in this game, I wasn't too familiar with that plan. I played queen c2 instead. And I actually had a deliberate reason for doing this and playing a3 before castling, was I wanted to make it harder for black to put this bishop on d6, which I think was a pretty reasonable way to play this position. Now, my idea basically, if you play bishop d6, I'll play knight b5 right away, because you haven't played a6. And if I can take the bishop pair, then I should be pretty happy. So here, if he wants to keep his bishop, he pretty much has to play bishop f8. It's actually interesting. The engine actually wants to take on c3 here. Actually, it does think that white is slightly better after bishop f8, just because it'll take you an extra tempo then to later play bishop d6. You have to play a6 first, and then white's kind of achieved something, because queen c2 is useful, a3 is useful. I'm going to play b4 anyway, but black has had to lose time with this bishop f8 to d6 shuffle. But actually, yeah, the engine surprisingly thinks that it's okay to take here, and it basically says that you're going to combine some like knight e4, c5, and bishop a6 here. And this kind of position, for example here, knight e4, queen c2, black will recapture the pawn on c5, and after castling, play bishop a6. And I mean, to my eyes, a position like this would look more pleasant for white, but this is actually close to being totally equal for black. I think mainly because of this target on b3. So black has a very simple plan of playing like rook b8, queen b6. This knight on a6 is kind of bad, but it can remaneuver over here to c7 and e6, where it's going to be really well placed. And these hanging pawns are not really super weak right now. They're not under a lot of pressure, and yeah, so this would be a playable position for black. Although I think in human terms, it's probably more comfortable to have white. So, okay, but anyway, it's very understandable that he didn't want to do any of that, so he just played bishop f8, and I castled. Bishop b7. So now this is more normal. I played b4, knight b7. We actually have transposed into some games in the database, so like this position has been seen before. And at this point, I did have the right idea here. I played rook b1, so I want to play b5. I don't want to play b5 right away, because then he plays a6, and I can't keep a pawn on b5, which is very important. So if I play a4, he'll take. Because of this pin, I have to take back with a piece. And this position really is nothing special for white, because this has not been fixed as a weakness. In fact, even here, black would consider playing c6 on bishop a6 to trade off these bishops. And sure, he has a weak pawn on c6, but I also have a weak pawn on a4. And later, black can play c5 and, really not have any issues. So this kind of position we want to avoid. If we play rook b1, now we're ready to play b5 and then meet a6 with a4. And we can take back on b5 with a pawn. making sure this stays backwards. Now, okay, there's actually some more finesse here that I could have included. I could have also included this move knight g5, which the engine points out is quite strong, because you're pretty much forced to play g6 here. You can't play h6 because then bishop h7 check, and okay, if you take, you get checkmated, but if you go here, you're going to lose. That's also checkmate, so losing the queen, and you get checkmated. So basically, black has to play g6 here. But then the point is that now we play rook b1, and we've kind of induced this weakening of the king side, and the knight on g5 is actually very hard to get rid of. And it also importantly controls the e4 square, so it makes it harder for black to organize this counterplay with knight e4 than knight f6. This is going to be kind of black's part of the board over here on the king side, which is where he's going to look to have some counterplay. And for example, like if you ever play h6, I mean, you have to prepare this a lot because you have to take into consideration knight takes f7. And this kind of position would probably be pretty good for white. And then we can just trade off the two minor pieces for the rook and 2 pawns and play a4 here. We'll just continue with our queenside plan. And this king has also been permanently weakened. I mean, with this bishop also being out of play, like white's definitely better here. It's just a question of is it a large advantage or just kind of a small advantage. So yeah, knight g5 definitely it would be a strong maneuver to take note of in the future. But yeah, I didn't really have. This is kind of one of the drawbacks of playing positions without having like super deep knowledge of them. Is that like all these little, like I know the main plan, which is to play b4 a4 or b1, and I know that there's this other plan to play like knight e5 f4. But these little very nuanced details I was not quite as familiar with. So I played rook b1, and now he plays a6. Now, I should point out that one of the other ways that black can play this position is to play c6, and then now he's ready to say, if you ever play b5, I'll play c5 and just push by, and then if you take on c5, I'll take with his b pawn, and basically end up with these 2 pawns in the center against your a and b pawns over here. And whenever black does this, he's going to close down his bishop, and here white should switch his attention over to either the center, playing for e4, or over on the king side. So like here, if black had played c6, it would have been very good for white to continue with knight g5. And after the same g6, we would just continue with like f4 here. And this would be a pretty reasonable way for white to play. We can just play bishop d2, maybe bring this rook to e1. We'll just forget about this part of the board for now, and instead, focus from like the f5 break, playing e4 at the right moment, and black will come under some pressure on the king side. So instead of he plays a6, and now I play a4, and now he plays bishop d6. So a6 was a very useful move because it allows his bishop to sit on d6. Now there's no knight b5, and it also has forced me to spend an extra move on a4, so before I can play b5. And yeah, here's like kind of another moment where I play something that's not the most precise. I played queen b3 with, it's kind of a strange move because I didn't follow it up consistently. So like the idea would be we're putting pressure on this pawn on d5 and making it harder for this knight to move. Although in the game then I did move, and then I didn't end up taking on d5. So we'll see what happened. But actually here b5 would be the precise way to go. And the reason is after queen b3, you let black have a chance to actually now play c6. And I think this situation, like black can be considered to be about equal. The main point is that now, like we can't really play knight g5 anymore. There's a number of reasons. I mean, one, our queen is no longer on c2, so black would simply play h6, and the knight has nothing better to do than retreat. But also now that this bishop is on d6, black can simply take on h2, and then this tactical shot will be good for black. We'll take the knight back later. So, yeah, I mean, here white would have to probably return to playing for e4. Black has that square really well under control and can just plop a knight in there next turn. And even though this bishop looks really passive, like, even playing like a5 here, black can lock it up with b5. And in the long term, he has this plan of transferring a knight to c4. And my b4 pawn also gets fixed as a target. So this queen on e7 and the bishop on d6 will make it hard for me to maneuver without losing this pawn on b4. This bishop on d7 is pretty bad, but it can come back to the game from c8, and it's really like black's only bad piece. All the rest of his pieces will be pretty good. I mean, you can argue my bishop on c1 is also not very good, so kind of both sides have their problems here. And that position would be about equal. Now I thought he plays knight e4, which definitely is a mistake. Now, he did spend 7 minutes on this move, so I think he probably considered what the best response was for white, and maybe he just misevaluated it. And I also considered the best response for white, and I also misevaluated it, so very interesting. Now, this move looks like a blunder because it lets us take on d5, but there's actually a tactical point here, so black's idea is to play knight c3, winning the exchange. Now, I did consider this, so just because we lose the exchange doesn't mean, like, it's all over. We have a pawn for it, and if we get these center pawns moving, e4, e5, we could potentially have a lot of pressure over here on the king side. And, like, if white could right away get this pawn up to e5, he definitely is better. Like, there's not even any question. He has more than full compensation for the exchange. And I evaluated that correctly. I wasn't really worried if black would just play h6 here, then it's actually even more accurate to start with b5 here. If you play e4 right away, then you might allow this c5 break, which makes the game a little bit messy, because we'll open up some files for the rooks, and you don't really want to play d5. That's going to give away the e5 square. But if you start with b5 first, it's counterintuitive to open up the a file, but this really doesn't do anything. The rook has no targets there. And now you can never play c5, because we'll just take this way. And next move, I play e4. You can't stop it. Knight f6, I still play e4. That's actually, now the knight will be a target after e5. And even if you play like knight f8, e4, black is up in exchange for only a pawn, but this position is like clearly better for white. So this I evaluated correctly. Like I knew that white would be much better here, and this is like +1 already. That is a really serious advantage. But yeah, what I didn't quite appreciate was if black plays queen e7 here. This is the move that concerned me, because if I just have to defend this and play bishop d2, then after knight f6, this is unclear. Like, I was not sure that white actually has full compensation here, because now I won't really be able to play e4. This knight is going to go in there, and he can play f5 to just bolster it up. And white's not actually worse here, but like I was correct in deciding that you're not really better, and this probably would be risky to go into. But actually, like what I didn't really appreciate was, obviously we can take on h7, king h8. But I just kind of rejected this because I thought, well, now I have to retreat my bishop. Otherwise, you'll play g6. As soon as I do that, then you can take on b4. And this I wasn't really sure about, because now black might have some idea to play c5 or play b5, open up some files on the queen side. I thought this was a pretty important pawn for me to lose, but actually the h7 pawn is much more valuable. And here, after e4, this position's already like basically winning for white, which is kind of surprising. This definitely I did not appreciate. And the reason it's winning is black's king is just permanently weak. It's actually surprising, but like we just have so many ideas to eventually be able to attack the king. We can play knight g5. This bishop can transfer to this diagonal. The queen always has ideas of transferring either from b3 or d3 over here to the h file. This bishop also has a lot of potential. Obviously it supports the knight from g5. It can transfer to this diagonal. This knight moves here, we can play f4 and get the rook involved. Like really, black actually is almost defenseless here. Like, if you tried for your counterplay with c5, like already white just plays knight g5, and this is basically, you're already in a lot of trouble. Like if you play, whatever, knight f8, then here we go, bishop b3. And this could just end in disaster very quickly, like knight e6. We'll take, play e5, and this is already going to be pretty much all over. The attack is just going to be too strong. You have to start like jettisoning a lot of material here with g6. So yeah, definitely I didn't really appreciate the potential for white in this position. Also like if you play f6 here, I think you can even transfer the knight back to h3 and then over to f4. Or you can go back to f3 and have the same idea with going over to h4. Like, this doesn't really help black's defense because all you did was weaken a lot of the light squares here, and you don't have a light squared bishop. Now this bishop can go to b3, your king will never be able to run away this way, and then all I need to do is play a check in the h file, and it's going to be like over. So yeah, this position would be really, really dangerous for black, and basically white is already winning here. So this is what I had misevaluated. I just kind of underestimated how weak black's king would be there. And yeah, in the end I played bishop b2, which definitely is not a critical move. And after this, now basically the position is equal. It's like black gets to play knight f6, and because these knights are really well coordinated now, black has basically enough counterplay on the king side to offset my positional domination over here on the queen side. So he always has ideas to play like knight g4, potential sacrifices on h2 or f2 or even e3. He can run the h-pawn up the board. So, he has enough counterplay, and white's not really in trouble, but black has enough activity here. So I played b5, takes, and what would be ideal here is if I could actually trade off these dark squared bishops, but as soon as he plays queen e7, you can see it's going to be really hard for me to actually ever do that. He just has so many attackers on this a3 square that it's going to take forever for me to actually be able to, organize a way to do this. Like, I'll have to defend this not only with a rook, but also with a knight somehow, and I think it's just going to be too slow. So, yeah, now the game kind of enters a maneuvering phase. Neither side really has an advantage here, so we're just kind of shuffling around. I played knight e2. So I just want to make some marginal improvement, play queen c2, play knight e5. If I can shut down this bishop, then I feel like black will not have a lot of counterplay. And there was maybe an interesting possibility here for black to play knight g4. So in this position, this is like his first big think of the game. So after queen e7, he had 95 minutes, and after knight e2, I had 89 minutes. And then he thought for 22 minutes on his next move, and he played h5, which I thought was a good move. So he's just basically also saying the position is about equal, and I'm going to just make small improvements over here on the king side and ask you what you want to do, right? I'm not sure if he was calculating this one. I figure he probably was, and I wasn't really afraid of it. I saw I can play h3. You can take on f2 and do all of this, but I didn't really see what the follow-up would be here. Like, his queen is pretty close to my king, but my knights cover all the important squares. He can't play this. He can't play bishop h2, and like, I figured next move, I'm going to play bishop c1 at the very least and just chase this queen away. Yeah, I mean, I think this is not really advisable for black to go into. So, once you trade off these two knights, like, these are really your most active attacking pieces, in addition to this bishop. So if you trade those two knights off just for this rook on f1, it's not really doing anything. Yeah, that positionally doesn't make a lot of sense. Now, yeah, I will show like one engine idea here. So I think engines sometimes can come up with very instructive ways of playing positions that a human wouldn't really consider. But they're usually backed by some pretty tricky tactics, which is why it's why they're engines and why their ideas are hard to find. But the engine actually has a very interesting idea here to play c5, which I'm not sure if he considered. Maybe this is what he was thinking about. I definitely would not have really considered this move for black, because it looks like, well, I'll just take, right? Take with the bishop. Now, I mean, it's not super hard to see that taking this pawn is just too dangerous. Like, if we take here, black actually has a very funny move, bishop d7, and this is just like a very vicious trapping of the queen, because even if she retreats here, now the point is we go to a4. This is just brutal. Like, if you go back, then you get trapped, and if you go here, you lose a lot of material after bishop c2. But no, the really brilliant thing is that, let's say, for a human, you would probably think, well, I'll just leave this pawn here and play like knight c3 now. Now I'm going to target this. I can take this later. I can just blockade it. And what exactly are you doing here? And the engine's idea here is to continue with b5, which is really, really clever. So you can't actually take this pawn. This is one of the tactical justifications. Now, after rook eb8, you're basically stuck in this eternal pin, where the queen can never leave the defense of this knight because it'll just get taken. But anyway, black is threatening queen queen d7 or queen b7, and the knight is just going to be lost eventually. But yeah, if you don't take this pawn, then black has actually this idea: just keep going, play b4, gain some space, and use this pawn as a diversion for like the main show over here, which is still some kind of knight g4 and some sacrifice on f2 or e3 or h2. So this is actually a very interesting way to play on both fronts, where already here white actually has to be careful. Like, if you play some natural move like rook a1, just saying let's trade rooks, already this is like really bad. Rook takes a1, and then knight g4, and black is basically winning because you just can't stop these sacrifices. Like, if you play h3, then we can just take on f2. I mean, this is going to be devastating. The queen arrives on e3, the bishop is hanging, so if you take this, we'll take the bishop. If you take this, then this is even worse. And you're going to get checkmated very quickly. And some this, or queen takes e3 check, anything is winning here. So, yeah, this pawn on b5 basically serves as a diversion. Like, already here, actually, probably knight c3 is a mistake. Like, white needs to focus on this side of the board, maybe play a move like knight f4, or you can't play knight e5, unfortunately, because of knight d2. So, maybe you need to play something like queen c2. so that you can prepare knight e5 or knight f4 just to block this bishop. And yeah, you really can't touch this pawn on b6. Like, and black just has this kind of slow idea to just slowly advance it and then take some squares on the queen side and restrict white. So yeah, this is a really interesting way to just, that basically turns your weak side of the board, the queen side, into a second front, when white is not really prepared to play on both sides of the board. And I think the reason black can do this, play on both sides of the board, is he has a little bit more space. Like this knight in e4 is really active, kind of cuts the board in half, and it's easy for black's pieces to transfer from one side of the board to the other. Like this queen can get over here very quickly, can get over here very quickly. This bishop is operating on both diagonals. This bishop on c6 and d7 will operate on two diagonals, whereas white's pieces are not really like coordinated in the same way. So anyway, yeah, I don't know if he was thinking about that. We talked a little bit after the game, but yeah, I don't think we talked about that moment. And instead he plays h5, a very human move. It's also very fine. Like the position is still equal. And then I played queen c2, so now I want to play knight e5. And yeah, the next few moves are pretty normal. Plays h4. Around here, yeah, there was an interesting moment where I could have played knight e5, as I was actually thinking about some kind of a pawn sacrifice here. Like my idea is if you take it and play knight g4, so I can't defend this pawn, because if I play f4, then e3 is going to be hanging. But my idea would be to play e6 here. And this is actually, like, I think this was a good idea. I wasn't sure how much my compensation would be. So, for example, if white takes it, then actually, I was originally thinking I could take on c7, but this actually loses right away to knight e takes f2, which would be an unfortunate blunder. So this will be hanging, and then my bishop is going to be lost. But instead, white just plays knight f4 here, and we can just slow play this. Like, you play queen e7, and we'll just play rook c1, and we're down a pawn, but we've opened up this beautiful bishop, and we've gotten rid of black's best attacking piece here. So these two knights now, they're going to be pretty strong, but I'll play h3, kick them back, and they're not really scary on their own. So this would be actually pretty good compensation for black, or for white. And like this actually, I think this also I was a little bit unsure of. Like I was considering I could take this and then play h3. And I wasn't really sure how much compensation I would have here, but actually, like, this position is really, really good for white. Like, after making this exchange, which is really strong, if you take with a queen, you lose this pawn on c7. Basically, what we've done is we've gotten rid of all of black's active pieces. Like, we played knight e5, getting rid of this bishop. After bishop takes e5 and knight g4, we sacrifice this pawn. And after f takes e6, we get rid of this knight. Then we get rid of this knight, play h3. So like we just systematically remove all of black's active pieces, and we're left with this position where black has an extra pawn, but his position is like a total mess. I mean, this pawn structure is really weak. His king is always going to be open. c7 is always a target. This bishop is really not that great. It has a nice square on d5, but it has no target, so it's just blocked by its own pawn. So like white would continue with rook f(c1) here, and then play knight f4 next move. c7 is always hanging. And I mean, it may not be like objectively a huge advantage for white, but this is the kind of thing that would be really tough for black to play. Like you have to play some really ugly moves like rook c8 and just be kind of passive and turtle up, which, yeah, for a human is definitely not easy to do. So I feel like that was maybe a small miss. I wasn't like fully sure of my compensation there, and instead I just went with a safe option, h3, which is okay. I mean, it just keeps the game approximately equal. And now, okay, we continue maneuvering. So knight d7, which makes sense. He wants to stop knight e5. And now we do this little rook shuffle. I play rook bc1, and my idea is actually to play knight e5. And after a mass trade there, we're going to end up with this position where I can take on c7. So like if you play some random move, king f8, then I can play knight e5. This is a very typical tactical trick where we sacrifice a pawn temporarily, then to take on c7. So this usually ends up being good for white. So he plays rook a8. Okay, but now I play rook a1. So I kind of lured his rook over here to then go over here to the a file. So he plays rook a8. And I think I probably could have just repeated. I don't know if he would have done something different if I had just gone back and forth rook a1, but I wasn't really playing for a draw here, so I wanted to take. My idea here was that if we trade rooks, I won't be as afraid of these sacrifices on f2. So now I play rook c1. And yeah, at this point, like I felt like I had been slightly outplaying my opponent. I mean, he definitely has achieved a little something over here on the king side. But I've gotten my clamp. I have this target on c7. I have this idea to eventually play knight e5, and I felt like, my position was making sense here. But then, yeah, then around here, the trend started going in the opposite direction. So he started playing good moves, and I started playing kind of second-rate moves. So he plays queen f6 here, which is a good move. So he definitely doesn't want to go passive, like rook c8. This stops knight e5, but now I can take the a file, and it's going to be hard for you to challenge it because then my queen will be able to invade. And this is going to get unpleasant. Like the queen goes to a7, and you always have to worry about, like this bishop doesn't have a lot of squares, and it's hard to defend. So yeah, black wouldn't want to do that. Queen f6 is a much better way to stop this plan because after knight e5, obviously f2 is hanging. So I kind of switched gears here. I decided to go back, knight c3, and yeah, I'm just kind of giving up on this idea of knight e5 temporarily, and I want to trade off this knight on e4. And I think knight c3 is a good move here. I just kind of got spooked by what happened next. I did consider also taking on e4 and then playing knight e5. I just wasn't sure if black keeps the tension here. So, like, obviously this I thought would be very good for white, and I evaluated this endgame correctly. Like here after knight c3, I thought white was much better, maybe even winning, but definitely much better, and that's correct. White is much better here, just because this knight is really powerful, and this pawn is weak, this pawn is weak, this rook is super active. Really, I only have one weakness on b5, but it's going to be very hard for black to attack it before losing like one of these pawns. So I evaluated that correctly. But what I wasn't sure about is if black just keeps the tension. Like you could play queen e6, for example, and if he just sits and does nothing, what have I really accomplished? I can play knight c4, but he's not going to let me take his bishop. And then I can attack this pawn, but on c7, but then the bishop will always come back. So this indeed would just be equal. Like really, white doesn't accomplish much. So I think I was correct not to go into that. Yeah, instead I played knight c3. And yeah, I would have been happy if he traded, because then I get rid of this really active knight. But instead he played a much better move, knight g5, which I kind of, now I've started to see some ghosts on the king side. This is a good move. I didn't actually anticipate it. So yeah, it came as a little bit of a surprise. But yeah, now I started to get a little bit, worried. I didn't necessarily want to take this, although I think probably this is fine. Like, I just somehow didn't want to let like this queen get over here, and then I saw some, unpleasant things happening with like knight f6 and bishop coming back to c8. I thought this queen is just really active here. So I played knight d2 instead, which is okay. The position is still about equal, but it's kind of trending in black's favor now. I do have an idea. I want to play f4, which if black allows, would be really strong. The knight would have to go back, and then I could play knight f3 back, and then I'll get my knight to e5, I'll target h4. That would be really good for white. But he plays a much better move. He plays queen e7 here. So he's stopping f4. And yeah, kind of around here, I start to play funny-looking moves. Like I played rook e1, which, I mean, still in this position, pretty much every move is just equal. But rook e1 is the kind of move that doesn't really do anything. Like here, if I'm going to move the rook, at least probably I should go to a1, because this rook on a8 is definitely going to be better than this rook sitting around over here on e1. And he just starts to slowly improve his position, like knight f6. And it's not easy to play this. Like here, the main issue is that black can just kind of improve his position at will. Like he can plop a knight on e4, he can play, just slow steps here, like g6, put the king on h7 maybe, and after moving this knight, play like f5, just slowly start to lurch forward here on the king side. Whereas for white, it's hard to come up with a constructive plan. Like I would love to trade off this bishop, but it's just going to take way too long to organize bishop a3. And yeah, I've kind of let these knights get too active here. And I realized around here that I needed to trade this knight off. So I played bishop e2, which has the right idea. I want to play knight f3 and trade this knight off. But there's a tactical problem with it. So he plays queen e6, which I anticipated. And I realized here that my intended knight f3 would actually lose to knight takes h3. So I had seen this from far away. But what I missed was in this position after knight e5, I thought that if I can do this, white is pretty much going to stop the attack. I'll play f4, bishop f1, and then get the queen over. But I realized here that I had missed he could take and play d4. And suddenly just open up this bishop, and white's actually just lost here. The game's over. So I kind of had to tuck my tail between my legs here and admit that I can't play knight f1 or knight f3. Instead I played knight f1. So now this sacrifice doesn't really work, because now after this, for example, I would be able to play f4, and very importantly, this knight cannot really jump in here. my next moves are going to be like bishop d3 and then get my queen over, and once the queen comes over to defend, it's going to be fine. But he just keeps making good moves, knight fe4. So now he actually has a big threat, queen g6, when it's going to be very hard for me to stop knight takes h3. And this is already, it's getting close to being like clearly worse for white. It is possible to kind of stop the momentum, and you have to find this really clever idea of bishop g4. And the point is we provoke f5 to then retreat to d1. So we block all the sacrifices on h3. And then if you play queen g6, the reason we went to d1 is that the queen guards f2, so we can play king h1 here. It's like, I mean, this is how the engine defends, and white is barely holding together here. Like, black is still better, but there's no like immediate knockout. But obviously, black can still improve his position. You can bring the rook in, maybe play for f4 later, and it's not super easy for white to get out of this mess that we've gotten to. So instead, I played f4, which it kind of almost solves my problems, but yeah, this weakness on e3 is too big a problem here. So he does take on c3. He plays what I expected, and I realized here that my intention was to play rook a1 in this position, and I thought if we trade rooks, that I thought white's definitely much worse here, but I thought it's like survivable because I have this weakness on e3, but I can play this. I can eventually maneuver my knight to f3, target this pawn. Actually play bishop c3, bishop e1, target that pawn, and I thought the position would be playable. But what I realized, like kind of once we got to this position after knight e4, I realized that if we did do this, he could play this strong move knight g3, and if I take it, he has queen takes e3 check, so that would just win a pawn, a very important pawn. And the only way to actually guard e3 is to play king f2, but then black can take on e2. And this position is strategically lost for white. Like, it's over. Because we've lost our most important minor piece. This pawn is now a big weakness, and later black is going to round it up. It's going to be really hard to stop black from just infiltrating on the light squares like this, and eventually picking up this pawn at b5. So I saw this position. I knew that it was probably losing for white, but the issue was I did not see a better alternative, because like I could play bishop d2 here, but then I was worried that eventually this rook would appear somewhere on the a file and be very unpleasant. Like bishop c8, let's say I play bishop d3, a position like this, rook a3. And black just has a lot of pressure. There's no immediate threats, but it's just a lot of pressure. And this is what the engine prefers to play, and black is much better here, but it's not winning. But yeah, in time pressure, like we were getting into some time pressure here, so around here we both had about 15 minutes left. So, yeah, I mean, that kind of position is tough to defend with little time, so I think practically I still made a reasonable decision here in playing after knight e4, rook a1. So he takes, and this all happened. He plays knight g3. I play king f2. He takes, queen takes. And yeah, white is losing here, but it's black still has to be accurate and convert, because I do have one source of counterplay, which is basically to get this knight active and either harass this h4 pawn or get the knight to like e5. And if I have this knight in the center doing something active, then that will be my source of counterplay. So yeah, I mean, his next few moves are very good. Queen f5, knight d2, bishop c8, improving the bishop, knight f3. And here he kind of starts to slip and give me some chances to get back in the game. To be fair, it's not super obvious to find like the strongest way to put the game away. He plays bishop e7, which is a very natural move, just defending the h4 pawn. But black actually does not really have the luxury of time to just slowly play the position and like defend his weaknesses. He kind of has to be immediate. And the reason is like now I'll play knight e5, and we'll see what happens later in the game. This knight gets to c6. And that gives me the very important option of playing bishop c3, bishop b4 to trade off this dark square bishop. So, like, I was kind of anticipating in this position after knight f3, if he plays bishop e7, like, I had already seen this idea. I could go here, here, and then try to trade these guys off. But yeah, I mean, it's not super obvious to see that, like, from this position, that you kind of have to already be quick. And the way to be quick here is to go for this counterattack, queen b1. So really, we don't really care about the h4 pawn. Like, black should just use that as a diversion and say, in the time it takes you to win this, I will go over here and collect this pawn. And if black can trade these two pawns off for each other, that position will be like a classic two bishops with pawns on both sides of the board, which it'll be like technically winning for black, actually. So, like for example, after queen b2, you could take on b2 and just play that endgame. It's actually even stronger to just keep the queens on the board. And the point is there's no way to actually chase this queen away. Like queen e2, she'll go to b3, and then like eventually she'll settle in on c4, where now if she's ever challenged, at this point black can just leave the queen there. And if you ever take, we're going to take with a pawn. If you take this, we'll just take here. And this is lost. I mean, if you trade queens, then black takes with a pawn and gets these monster passers. That's going to be over. If you don't trade queens, you're run the risk of getting checkmated. Like this queen has to go somewhere, and you have to start guarding these entry squares. So yeah, I mean, this would be it's just losing. So instead of that, he plays bishop e7. Now after knight e5, I have some chances. So now it's feeling a little more optimistic. And yeah, we're both down to like under 10 minutes here. I think we both had about 5 minutes on our clock. So he plays f6, I play knight c6, bishop d6, bishop c3. And it's kind of unfortunate that his queen and king are placed like this, because after bishop b4, I will actually be threatening to take this and win a piece. Because if he recaptures, I have this fork. So around here, he still had one last chance to kind of put the game away with queen b1. And time pressure, it's easy to just reject this move because you see queen h5 and you're like, well, this is perpetual. But actually, like, you have this, black has this clever maneuver here. You can play queen c2 check first. Wait, we'll just play king g1. If you take this bishop, this is indeed perpetual. Like, there's no way to get out of this. In fact, this would be really a tragic way to lose. If you try to stop like this, then you get checkmated, actually. Turn knight e7 and queen h5. But no, instead of taking the bishop, you play this move queen e4. So I think, yeah, this is probably would be the hard move to see in advance, especially with little time, where now you're threatening this, and if we go back to defend it, then we stopped queen e8 check, and black can just play like bishop d7 and slowly remove this knight. If we trade this knight for the light squared bishop, especially forcing this pawn to c6, then this pawn starts rolling, and white's position is not going to hold together. So queen b1 was his last chance here. He plays a very tempting move g5, which looks really good, but I had already seen this from earlier. I can play bishop b4, takes. After he takes on f4, I have this move queen g4 check, which I suspect is maybe what he missed. And well, we trade queens. This endgame, even though temporarily black is going to be up, actually 2 pawns up if he takes on g4, this is still going to be a draw because I take on d5, and these pawns are just all weak. I'm going to take back 2 pawns. Very easily. I'm going to be able to go here, then play like knight a8, knight back to d5, take on b6. Like for example, king f7, I'll take here. Bishop b6, I'll play knight a8. And we can have this kind of position where a lot of pawns will get traded, and there's still pawns on both sides of the board, but this should be an easy draw because my king is just going to come here. In the time it's going to take your king to go over here and round these guys up, my knight will be able to come back and eventually win like one of these pawns. So I mean, this ended up happening in the game. So yeah, he played king f7 instead. Knight takes d5, bishop b7, knight c7, bishop takes g2. Now I play d5, so I'm getting ready to play knight a8. Plays king e7. There's kind of one funny trick he can go for. He can play this kind of weird-looking move, bishop h1. And the idea is if I play knight a8, this is actually a big blunder, because now after h3, king f2, h2, king g3, bishop takes d5, white is losing. If I take the pawn, then my knight hangs. Otherwise, black is promoting. So I would avoid that. I would play king f2 here, and then it's still equal. But yeah, I thought that was maybe one last trick he could play for. Instead, he plays king e7, and now it's kind of an easy draw. So king f2, h3, knight a8. We're going to trade these pawns. And even though like bishop e6, king g3, he could have taken on g4, but it doesn't really matter. I'm going to go here, and if he tries to hold on to this pawn, I'll play knight f4 anyway, and I'm going to take this, then it's going to be a draw. So yeah, the game ended king d6, I take on h3, king c5, knight a4 check, king takes b5. He offered a draw here, which I accepted. It's pretty easy to see that after knight c3 and then knight e4, all the last pawns will get traded off, and we're going to be left with a drawn bishop versus knight position. So yeah, this is definitely a very rich game. A lot of things that I can definitely learn about this structure, like these little nuances with like putting the knight on g5 to provoke g6 when we still have this battery going on. Definitely this idea of the exchange sacrifice, like it was something that I was familiar with here on this position. Like I've even seen games where white does sacrifice the exchange here, and black it just gets rolled over with these pawns. But yeah, I wasn't like totally sure about pulling the trigger in this position if black plays queen e7. So yeah, like, this kind of situation where we're trading off the h7 pawn for the b4 pawn, I wasn't like totally sure how to evaluate that, and I did miss a pretty big chance there. Yeah, and then later in the game, I mean, I think it's also kind of interesting to point out this dynamic where black can choose to play c6 at some moment, where white is not able to coordinate this quick attack with knight g5 and f4. So like queen d3 was slightly imprecise because here black could play c6, and then he stops this plan at b5. Like the point is, if I ever play b5, he's going to take and play c5. And this kind of situation would just be good for black. If I take, you could even take back with a knight maybe, but taking back with a pawn now leaves you with two very nice hanging pawns in the center. This pawn at b5 doesn't really do much. It's going to be easily blockaded, and this position, like black is at least equal. So yeah, definitely a lot of interesting moments there. We kind of had this one critical moment in the middle game where we both misevaluated this exchange sacrifice, and then after that it was kind of a lot of maneuvering. We just shuffled our pieces around. Eventually, like the tide started to turn, and I lost the thread of the position around this knight g5 move. And yeah, then once I did get into a bad position, then I started defending well, and I found this resource with getting the knight to e5 and knight c6 and then bishop c3, b4, and then finding this idea to play queen g4 check. So it definitely a lot of a roller coaster of a game. It was we both pretty much used all of our time. So these are game in 100 with a 30-second increment. This game I think went on for like 5 hours. So yeah, definitely was very tired at the end of that. So yeah, I think after this there are 2 more games to go. And so yeah, the next game was one of my probably most impressive defensive accomplishments. It was a really funny game too. So I was playing an international master, Thomas Bartel, and then in the last round I was able to get a quick win against an FM, some opening preparation. So yeah, those will be the last 2 games from this tournament that I'll look at. So until then, yeah, I'll see you in the next game, and thanks for watching. And yeah, I'll see you next time.